Before we get started, I want to remind everyone that the information in this presentation is not to be or construed as investment advice. The information presented are subject to change without notice, and while we have made every reasonable effort to ensure that the content is reliable and accurate, we have not independently verified the content and are not responsible for errors therein. Please consult a professional advisor before putting a loonie in any of these financial markets.
Hi everyone, my name is Richard Diaz and welcome back to the IceCap Canadian Market Wrap. In this week's episode, we're going to address something that the next Prime Minister of Canada, Mark Carney, said in an interview and why it hits at the heart of one of the problems Canada faces, lack of investment. I was hoping to avoid doing another video on Carney, but what he said provides us with an opportunity to address what's going on in Europe and one of the reasons we as investors continue to shun that market, as well as risks for Canada. After years of championing a carbon tax in Canada, the two front runners for Prime Minister have vowed to scrap it. This is an incredible about-face and should be viewed with a healthy dose of skepticism. The carbon tax is unpopular and politicians will say whatever they need to get elected, especially when they're down in the polls. But what struck me as incredible is what they have in store for us as a replacement, and the lie that it would not affect consumers. Carney argued that by scrapping the consumer carbon tax and shifting the costs over to big business and the industrial sector, as well as introducing a carbon tariff, consumers and the government would not pay. This is total BS, and I will explain the logic of why and touch on two cautionary tales, real-world examples where climate promises of milk and honey have crushed industry and left consumers reeling. First, context. Mark Carney has a PhD in economics from Oxford and has, I think it's fair to assume, studied supply and demand theory. He has surely examined how tax burdens are redistributed between producers and consumers, and he would know that this is based on something called price elasticity of demand. You can identify this phenomenon daily as it explains why governments love to tax gasoline. There is no real substitute for gasoline. Ergo, oil demand has near perfect inelasticity. People need fuel to run cars, and if prices rise, they buy fuel anyway. If you make an unsubstitutable input, i.e. energy, more expensive for highly energy-intensive industries like steel, which Carney referenced, a couple of things will happen. To protect slim margins, firms will pass on those costs to consumers, and this will raise the price of every derivative of that product. Or firms will become less competitive versus their competition that have much cheaper input costs, think coal-fired China, and either ask for unproductive subsidies to survive or move to jurisdictions with cheaper energy. With that in mind, I present this chart. The average electricity price for industrial users in dollars per megawatt hour. Near the top of our list is Germany, which is facing an energy crisis that is impacting all of European industry, the euro, and the political union that keeps it all together. How did we get here? Well, it's never just one thing. In this case, it's a combination of renewable energy targets, the phase out of nuclear power, and of course, the Russian attack on Ukraine. The latter was out of Germany's control and sent natural gas prices and energy prices soaring for a time. But the first two were the result of dogmatic green energy policy and the climate promises that underpinned them. First, nuclear. To say that the phase-out was an insane act of economic self-harm would be an understatement. While countries like China are ramping up investment, Germany shut down what were widely viewed as some of the best and safest nuclear power plants in the world. The plan was to replace nuclear with renewables, but this failed promise has had a material impact on German citizens. As the industrial base of Europe, Germany is a power-hungry economy. Its energy demand dwarfs that of Italy, France, and Spain. This is because all manner of manufacturing, for example, cars and chemicals, require reliable and affordable energy. The problem is that solar and wind power depend on weather conditions, and this intermittency makes them less reliable for base load power unless, of course, they are supported by storage or backup systems. In Germany, this means coal. But as we highlighted at the beginning of the episode, energy demand is inelastic. One cannot run energy-intensive industry without energy. And when cheap energy disappears, what happens? These low-margin businesses cannot afford to operate, and so they don't. The following chart makes that very clear. Energy-intensive production has collapsed, and make no mistake about it, consumers are paying the price. As firms like BASF, Volkswagen, Krupp, and many others shutter their doors and move elsewhere, jobs are lost, tax revenue disappears, and consumers ultimately pay the price. Indeed, Germany is now mired in recession, and the euro, which reflects this weakness, continues to fall. And to cap it all off, Germany is now importing an incredible amount of energy from its neighbors, which include France, where nuclear makes up 75% of electricity generation. How ironic. And because Europe is one large grid, it is pushing up electricity prices everywhere, and countries like Norway and Sweden, where prices have always been very low due to hydro and nuclear, are considering leaving the electricity grid altogether. In the UK, record electricity imports are covering for another failed climate promise, that net zero would have virtually no downsides. Problem is, renewables are not, in fact, fit for purpose. This has led to the most expensive energy prices in the world. And again, what this means is that industry cannot survive. Jobs disappear, and the UK is forced to import goods that would otherwise be produced at home, adding to the pressure on the currency. The same is true for energy imports, which, as they weigh on the trade balance, is also bad for the pound. What is doubly fascinating about the UK is that while paying the highest prices for energy in Europe and possibly the world, it sits on massive oil and gas reserves, which they won't exploit because they remain pot committed to net zero. As investors, we care because this is affecting the UK's productivity growth, and thus their ability to navigate the growing issue around their twin deficits, a topic we will discuss in a future video. But in short, we're concerned about the UK bond market and the pound. What Carney and the like are arguing is that to protect Canadian industry, a carbon border adjustment mechanism must be implemented. This is also known as a carbon border adjustment tax or tariff, which is levied on imported goods based on the emissions emitted during production. This is because there are jurisdictions that do not care about carbon emissions at all. For example, China, which over the last 25 years has sucked up loads of energy-intensive production capacity on the back of very cheap coal. The problem is that Canadians will ultimately pay the price. This will happen in two ways. Higher costs for energy will, at the margin, make Canada a worse place to do business in and invest capital in, at a time where capital investment is lagging and desperately needed. This will further slow productivity growth. And two, tariffs will raise the cost of products, and those costs are always passed down to the consumer, hurting consumption and again growth. Finally, to bring it all together, without more capex, improvements in productivity, and eventually better growth, Canada will remain a poor investment, and the loonie will continue to be under pressure. All right, that's a wrap on this week's episode. Thanks again for listening. Please like, subscribe, and follow for more. And as always, we manage money for families all over the world and Canada, so please feel free to get in touch.